In life, there are so many different kinds of experiences that a person can have, and many people go throughout their life never having some of these greatest experiences which are available. Some experiences are minutes long, and other experiences are ones that last years, if not decades. For example, being a parent is an experience that I just never could have understood unless I had experienced it for myself. And it lasts a really long time. On the other hand, I'm sure skydiving is an experience that is breathtakingly incredible, but doesn't really last very long. I'm going to turn for a moment to the experiences which are in the religious field. So, if you look in history, religious history, and you study up on some of the religious figures, you find that they have these experiences, which they term as being spiritual. And Siddhartha or Buddha talks about reaching enlightenment and coming to a realization, many things, seeing the universe a different way. You can read about figures like Zoroaster, who went down by a river and fasted for many days and prayed. Then they had this certain kind of experience. Or you can read about people like Muhammad, who went into the wilderness and fasted and prayed for many days and then had a certain kind of experience. But even going into the Bible, or I guess especially going to the Bible, figures like Moses went up into a mountain and fasted and prayed. And I can go on and on and on. And I would assume that the pattern for all of the prophets spoken of in the Bible is probably the same pattern. Going out into the wilderness and, or at least finding some sort of solitude, whether it's in their closet or whatever it may be, and then praying and fasting and seeking after God, and then having an experience. And I want to share some of my theory on how these spirit experiences are attained, how they're had, if somebody would like to have this kind of experience. So I want to go through some things that I think are kind of critical or important. In some religious writing, they talk about this experience as having the ministering of angels, or in other words, having being visited by an angel. And the idea is this, that in most of religion, if you want to get knowledge, you go to a religious book, there's all this writing, and you can read all this information in this religious book. But what if the information that you're seeking for is actually not written in a book? So how do you get the information? Or how did some of the ancient prophets get this information to begin with when it wasn't written down? I believe that they had spiritual experiences. And then this information was revealed to them in one of two ways. One of the ways is they had a dream. And in their dream, they had, I don't know how to do this, they had the questions that they had answered. They were visited by, an angel or a heavenly messenger that then taught them the information which they didn't have. And then when they woke up, they wrote down what they had learned themselves after being taught in a vision. The other way of receiving information that hasn't been written down yet is to have it written down by something that is sometimes called revelation. So a person, while awake, will actually, through a lot of meditation and prayer, suddenly have information put into their own minds, almost as if someone was speaking to them. And in the scriptures, sometimes they call this the gift of revelation. Sometimes they call it hearing the voice of the Lord. And then the person, sometimes afterwards and sometimes during, will write down all the things that they learned from this revelation. So how does a person receive these things? How is it that some people have these experiences and other people don't? I certainly don't know all of the ins and outs, but I do have some theories and some ideas, and I'd like to share what those are. First of all, it's based on a principle called faith. And faith is something that grows by degrees, and it grows by action. So I'm going to look at the human brain for a second. And I'm not actually looking at any particular part. I'm kind of drawing out a theory about how this works. So a person has, with their eyes and with their finger and with their tongue and with their ears, I hope I'm not missing any senses there, input of information. And all this input of information is what allows them to get information into their brain. And that's how they know things. If they've seen it, I guess they could also get information through their nose too. If they've seen it, if they smelled it, tasted it, heard it, or touched it, then they can say that they know it. Then there's this other part of someone else saying that they have experienced something. And then you can say, well, if somebody else, has experienced it, then you can believe it. So I can believe that someone else's sensation, or someone else's experience comes into my mind, and they can believe it. But in religion, there is another kind of sensation, which is a sensation to I guess the mind. In religion, though, they refer to it as the spirit. And this is another way of knowing something. In other words, they've had some sort of experience with their spirit, and then they believe something. Or they can even say that they know something. So when a person has a sufficient amount of faith, there are parts of their mind, let's say back here in the occipital lobe, that are for vision, for sight. And one of the inputs for this part of your brain is in through your eyes, and it goes back and then relays the images of whatever you're seeing back here in your brain. But there's another input from another part of the brain that also ends up there. It's what's active during dreams, where your brain, your own mind, is creating images based on what it is thinking about or what it is experiencing in a different way. And these are dreams, and some people have these dreams when they're awake, and some people have them when they're asleep. Some people have disorders in their brain where they are psychotic and they hallucinate, or schizophrenic, they can hallucinate and they can see things that are not there. And some people have these experiences, of course, while dreaming, and there's nothing pathologic to it at all, and they see things which are not there. And another way that a person can see things is if they believe something so strongly that their mind will actually input it as if it was there, even though it isn't. And that is an incredible amount of faith. And I would say that someone who has this level of faith, in religious terms, they would call them a seer, someone who can see things based on their faith. And faith itself is things that are not seen, but which are believed. So if we're looking at an individual's faith, there's that other input. There's their mind. There's, let's say, their spirit. A person can have these kinds of spiritual experiences, and these spiritual experiences can enhance your faith, and it can allow you to have these sorts of experiences that otherwise you wouldn't be able to have. So, how does somebody increase their faith in order to be able to have this experience? Well, first of all, they have to hear. So you'd have to hear, or you'd have to read, or somehow watch, get the idea of certain spiritual concepts. Okay, most of these being referring to a being known as God. Okay, there's a lot of different names for them. I think that's the most appropriate name in English is God. So the Lord, for Jesus Christ. There's a lot, but there's a million names for it over the history of the world, in a lot of different nations. So you get these spiritual ideas, and if you, a good place for them for most people is going to be in the scriptures, which are really old books or texts that talk about these ideas and talk about people who've had these kinds of experiences with these ideas. So essentially, in order to have these experiences, you read the scriptures, and the scriptures will help you to develop faith, or in other words, to kind of get the idea of what it is that you're even developing faith in. Okay. So once you've started developing your faith, if you actually believe what it is that you're reading about or hearing, then you're going to act on it. But the interesting thing is that when you act on it, it actually also, it will either decrease your faith or it will increase your faith. So some people will get ideas and then they'll act on them and they'll be like, wow, those were terrible ideas. I don't know why I acted on those ideas. And other people will have ideas and then they will act on them, and they will find that their ideas are strengthened by acting on them. And so that faith that they have will increase. Those spiritual ideas being planted in their mind will increase to a degree. So after you have acted on these ideas and you have faith, this can take a lot of time. This is not an easy step. Let me talk about some of the things involved in this step. So action can a lot of times mean moral action. When you read about a lot of these spiritual texts, they talk about living an extremely moral lifestyle, avoiding something they call lasciviousness, which is lusting for anyone other than your spouse. So avoiding all forms of pornography, even any kinds of pornographic type thought, lascivious thought, avoiding all those kinds of things. So very, very moral action. Also, avoiding any kind of greed, avoiding pride where you think that you're better than other people. I should probably put avoid these things. Avoiding anger, avoiding contention, avoiding all these kinds of things. Contention, you gotta be careful with that one because it depends on the motivation for the intention. I guess pride-related contention. Avoiding all these kinds of different subjects. And by avoiding these things, the person is actually, or by doing these things, the person is actually developing their faith because they're acting on those things that they heard. But it's more than just things that you avoid. It's also generous, kind, showing compassion towards others. These are all the things that are encouraged in these religious texts. Giving to the poor, visiting those who are alone or sad, really truly going out of your way, trying to be what we all understand to be as good a person as possible. And now some people really get excited here because they've seen some religious texts that really encourage, they say that, well, if you if you follow this religion, then you'll go out and you'll kill people because that increases your faith. And that, I don't know what religious text exactly the person be following, but if that was the kind of thing encouraged, remember earlier I said if you act on it, it increases the faith that you have, versus, if in other cases you act on it and it decreases your faith because of the way that you feel. You need to kind of pay attention to the way that you feel. And I don't know how a person, well, I guess I'll say though, peace, love, joy, these kinds of things should increase in your life. And if you're living a religion that encourages you to act violently for the sake of getting some sort of reward. I've heard of some religions teaching, you do this and then you'll get to have a bunch of virgins in the next life and these things like that. Now, that seems mostly that it's based off of greed and based off of lasciviousness. The person is literally trying to live their religion in order to get a reward. In that case, the motivation is totally corrupt, totally messed up. That can't be the motivation. To get the reward of greed and lasciviousness. There is something that you're seeking for in this, but it's not a greedy, lascivious kind of motivation at all. So acting on these kind of things increases your peace, increases your love, increases your joy, all these kinds of things. It should also make you less judgmental and less proud as well. You'll feel these kinds of things. You'll feel more humble. I guess you could say more humble. Lots of these kinds of emotions should happen if you're doing it correctly. If the religious teachings, the spiritual ideas that you're adhering to are of the right type, then these kinds of things you'll notice they'll start to increase in your life. And if you're adhering to the wrong kinds of spiritual ideas, that will not be the case. Anyways, so you continue to act on these things, and these sorts of attributes will start to increase in your life. And then you'll get to a point where you'll actually start to get input. I was talking earlier, the input to your brain, that part of your brain where, remember, you have all the different senses. You have the eyes, the nose, taste, and you've got the touch. And then you've got that input that we call spiritual input. There will come a time, at least this is my understanding from my studies in this field, that you'll actually start to get inputs from your brain that are as if it's from another sense. And this input will be what they call your first spiritual experiences. But at first they come, you may not be very experienced with this, and you may not be able to discern what is a spiritual experience and what is your own mind. So it can be kind of difficult for some people, maybe all people, especially at first, to discern, wait, was that my mind that just had this thought, or was this a spiritual experience that I just had? And I really feel that if a person is really having a spiritual experience, that they'll be able to identify that it's a spiritual experience. And if they're having serious doubts as to whether or not it's a spiritual experience, then it probably isn't a spiritual experience. And that's just based on my own study of this subject. So, however, they'll have ideas come into their mind, more and more ideas, and these ideas will be new ways to apply the things that they have been seeking after. Ideas for good things. Their mind will come up with ideas. Ideas to help someone. Or ideas of maybe they need to stop viewing a certain kind of media. Or maybe to spend more time in prayer, or more time in study, or more time serving in some capacity, or those sorts of things. Or maybe they'll get a sudden idea come into their head of someone that they should go help. And it doesn't have to be like even saying that these ideas of things coming into their mind are even spiritual ideas to begin with. It can just be the fact that they're thinking about people, and they're concerned about people, and they think of certain ideas and ways or times that they could or should go and help these people. And as you act on that, sometimes call these promptings. It's almost like a test of your faith, like a trial of your faith. After you act through these promptings or these trials, and some of these things that you have to give up, that your mind, it's almost like blockades in your mind of things that you have to work through in order to get to the next experience, can be very difficult. It can be giving up things that you really don't want to give up, sacrificing things in your life that are a great source of joy to you, maybe, or I guess joy, a pleasure to you. But on the other side of giving these things up will be these kinds of experiences, these spiritual experiences. So if you will, stop watching these kinds of movies or listening to this kind of music, or if you will start helping people in this way, or if you have this idea to help someone and you act on these ideas, you got to be really careful here, because this is where your own brain you can be like, wait, is this something that I'm supposed to do? And people can get really tied up in knots here, wondering if they're having spiritual experiences and not really being sure if they are or not. And they can do some really odd things here. So you got to be kind of careful in this stage, that you're not, doing things that are just your own brain kind of confusing you. And again, if you are having confusion there, it might be good to seek out somebody to talk to about it, who maybe is also somebody you look up to who's had these kind of spiritual experiences. If you don't have that, that's where church really comes in handy. If you don't have that available to you, then you can kind of weigh it out on your own. But really, when you have a spiritual experience, it should be pretty clear whether it's a spiritual experience or not. So again, if you're not sure whether or not it's your own idea, I would say most cases, in my experience, probably all cases, it probably is not spiritual. If it is spiritual, you will be very certain of it. And prayer and meditation is kind of where that comes into. You can do more of that. So anyway, now once you've kind of gone through this stage, and this stage can last years, possibly years of dedicated actions, seeking other people to help them, studying the scriptures, praying, years of this kind of behavior. Then eventually, after all this dedication to your faith, those ideas, and assuming that they're growing. Some aspects of it you may start acting on, find that it doesn't grow. As I mentioned earlier, these promptings that you have over here will start to yield actual, I guess first, sorry, I need to back up a little bit here. Then a person will often seek for knowledge or information, what they call mysteries of God, or those sorts of things. But in order to seek for these kinds, or I guess sometimes they also call it the gifts of God, in order to really have these kinds of experiences, the person really needs to have the right kind of motivation, or in other words, sincerity. Sincerity. If the person's motivation behind seeking after this information or these mysteries or the gifts of God is in any way to gratify their pride, or to, in other words, like, look, tell people, and then people will think that they're spiritual or good or smart or something like that, or any other kind of motivation like that whatsoever, like money or greed or anything at all, then they will not have these kinds of experiences. And a lot of what goes with that is you have to be completely willing, not only willing, but I guess in a way determined not to share any of the experiences, any of the knowledge, anything that you've that you have, to not share any of that with anyone ever. And that's really hard, which means you can learn things, you can learn knowledge and information and have these kinds of experiences, but then not be able to share what you've experienced with anyone. And that really removes the ability for you to do any of this for the sake of gratifying your pride or having a bad motivation. Because if you're not going to share it with anybody, then nobody would know, and you wouldn't, have that kind of pride that it's a problem. So, you got to make sure that motivation piece is in place, as well as all the other places, the moral part, all those kinds of things. So if the motivation is there and you really have a sincere heart with all of this, you're really just seeking to learn things from God, then over time you can have this experience. And after having this experience, you may end up having other things as well, like maybe revelations, maybe visions, any of these kinds of other spiritual gifts. And you might have them, you might not have them. I think it depends on some other things. I'm sure there's many other factors that I'm leaving out here. For example, I won't go into that. So anyway, I hope this video is helpful for someone who, again, this is just basically, the way that I'm trying to approach this as best as I can is to some degree of a academic approach to people understanding that other people have these, throughout history, other people have had these kinds of experiences, and how it is that they have these kinds of experiences. I'm not saying anything here about whether or not these experiences are actually spiritual. That wasn't the point of this at all. The point of this was to say that there are types of experiences that a person can have in this life, and this is a pattern that, based on my personal study, may help them to have these kinds of experiences if they seek for it. I, however, do believe that these experiences are spiritual. I do believe in God, and I do believe that these kinds of experiences are possible. I'm also an extremely skeptical person, and so if someone ever comes up to me and tells me about one of these kinds of experiences, I usually have serious doubt that they've actually experienced them. And I think a lot of these kinds of supposed experiences are actually just pseudo-spiritual experiences, where the person has confused themselves into they're not sure if they're having an experience or they're not having an experience, and they're not of the same type as this is. I think that's a very, very common thing that happens a lot. So I don't think that anytime someone says, oh, I had a spiritual experience or whatever, that they actually had one. Also, these kinds of spiritual dreams or spiritual visions can be very easily mistaken for just ordinary dreams or visions. And the ability to discern between one or the other, or whether it's your own mind, whatever, is not an easy thing. Unless you've really experienced it firsthand, and then you can get some experience on how to discern between the two. And so I'm not in any way saying that I believe everybody. I'm actually extremely skeptical, like 90% skeptical of pretty much everything out there. Anyway, hope this is helpful for people, and if at least you can approach this subject of religion from an academic kind of approach to see where this, I guess, may come from, even if you don't believe as I believe, and that's okay, because I'm open-minded too. I try to keep myself open-minded to the possibility of lots of things. I could be wrong. This could all be, experiences contained within the human mind. It doesn't seem that way based on what I've experienced. I think that, though, is a discussion for another time. So anyway, I hope this video is helpful, and goodbye.